I am thrilled to see so many people here in person on this chilly October morning in Chicago. Thanks for coming. And those of you still in your jammies on Zoom, thank you for joining us as well. Today's program is Masters of the Middle Waters, Indian Nations and Colonial Ambitions Along the Mississippi with Jacob Lee. Our co-sponsor for our colonial history lecture series is the Society of Colonial Wars in Illinois in partnership with the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. The Society for Colonial Wars is a national historic and genealogical organization with more than 4,000 members who trace their ancestry to a soldier, sailor, or government official who served in America between 1607 and 1775. I guess after 1775, it wasn't colonial anymore, right? Got it. Its mission is to perpetuate the memory of those who served as well as events of the colonial era. It also educates the public about the period by sponsoring lectures and publications and offering financial support to colonial era researchers and authors. Today's talk is the 13th in our colonial history lecture series since this partnership began in 2016. And it's the first one to take place in person since 2019. If you're new to the Newberry, the library supports and inspires research, teaching, and learning in the humanities. Our reading rooms and exhibition galleries are open to readers at no charge with no appointment necessary, Tuesdays through Saturdays. Our exhibition galleries are open today, so if you'd like, please plan to visit our current exhibition, Seeing Race Before Race, after the program. I also would like to invite you to our next free public program, which is next Thursday, November 2nd at 6 p.m. Central, either here at the Newberry or via live stream. I hope that you can join us for this year's McNichol Lecture with Elizabeth Ellis. She'll be speaking on myths, memory, and indigenous survival in the Gulf South. And if you can make it in person, there will be a reception beforehand in the lobby starting at 5 p.m. I also want to mention, we don't have a slide for it yet because we don't have a title, but next April 6th, 2024, will be the next colonial history lecture, and it will be with John William Nelson from Texas Tech. Programs like this one are free and open to the public, thanks to the generosity of our community of donors. If you'd like to help support our work, consider making a gift to the Newberry online. At the end of his talk, Dr. Lee will answer some questions from the audience. Those of you both here in the room and joining us on the live stream, please text your questions at any time to this number, 833-899-3399. And the number will also be up on slides during the program. Now let me hand things over to Aaron Barlow of the Society of Colonial Wars in Illinois.
Thank you. Yes, I am Aaron Barlow of the Society of Colonial Wars in the state of Illinois. And as was mentioned, we are a lineage society, but our mission is to promote knowledge and understanding of the colonial period. So we are thrilled as a society to co-sponsor this lecture series with the Newberry and the University of Illinois History Department. We are also thrilled to have the first live in-person lecture since the pandemic. But today we are especially happy that the topic is about the Midwest. These history lecture series cover the entire colonial period, and most of the research, most of the books are about the East Coast. But today we have a scholar who works extensively in the colonial history of the Midwest. So we are thrilled about that. Our speaker today is Jacob Lee. He is an associate professor of history at Penn State University. He has held fellowships at numerous institutions such as the Huntington Library in California, the Filson Historical Society in Louisville, and our very own Newberry Library. He's currently working on a history of the competing legal claims of the Cherokee, Osage nations, and the United States in the mid-19th century. His first book is Masters of the Middle Waters, Indian Nations and Colonial Ambitions Along the Mississippi, which was based in part on some of the research he did here at the Newberry. It is a fascinating book. It is dense with facts about the Midwest and about Illinois in particular, going back to the complex conflicts that took place between 1050 and 1425 AD along the Illinois River, involving the descendants of the Cahokia Mississippian mound-building civilization and other nations in central Illinois. The story, of course, is based on what we know from archaeology from several sites in central Illinois, and Professor Lee weaves together the details of what archaeologists have found, including how many people died in a specific massacre that occurred long before 1492, and weaves it together into a grand story arc about how the successors of the Cahokia civilization held on in central Illinois, but ultimately gave way, leaving this region empty of human civilization for 2 centuries. And that's just the first chapter. I highly recommend the book, and it will be on sale in the bookstore after the lecture. So I'm looking forward to many more publications from Professor Lee that will change the way I think about the state I live in. Please join me in welcoming Jacob Lee.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Thanks so much to Aaron for that introduction. Thank you to the Society for Colonial Wars for sponsoring this lecture series, along with the Department of History at University of Illinois and the Newberry. I also want to thank Alicia Zymet, Karin Christensen with Corman for all of their help, organizing my presentation today. It's been a very smooth process, and I'm very excited to be back here. I also want to acknowledge that we meet today on the homelands of the 3 fires of the Anishinaabeg, the Illinois, the Miamis, and the Sauk and Fox, as well as Ho-Chunks, Menominees, Kickapoos, and Mascoutins. I spent over a decade studying these nations and the history of this region, and I always am excited about having the opportunity to come back to this place. And it's particularly a pleasure to return to the Newberry. As Aaron mentioned, I have been a fellow here before, fortunately on 2 different occasions, and every time I come back, it's really a fantastic experience. I've also worked with the Newberry's Consortium in American Indian Studies, which is really amazing, and I'm just so happy to be back here and having the chance to speak with you all this morning. So I want to start off by giving you an overview of my book, Masters of the Middle Waters, and then focus on one story that highlights the book's 2 central themes. Masters of the Middle Waters examines efforts by Indian nations as well as Europeans and Euro-Americans to exert authority over the central Mississippi River Valley, the confluence of many of the continent's largest and most important rivers, the Mississippi, the Missouri, the Ohio, as well as the Illinois, Wabash, Tennessee, and Cumberland rivers. This story largely focuses on the Illinois nation, whose homelands are centered on what is now called the Illinois River, the Osage Nation, who lived in the present-day states of Missouri, Kansas, Arkansas, and Oklahoma, and the Chickasaws of present-day Mississippi. And to orient you here, if you can see my red dot, the Mississippi River is there, the Ohio, the Wabash, the Missouri, and we're going to spend a lot of time today talking about the Illinois country down south into the homeland of the Chickasaws. Between the 1600s and the 1800s, 4 empires, France, Spain, Great Britain, and the United States, claimed all or part of this region to varying degrees of success. My book, Masters of the Middle Waters, has 2 central themes. First, I argue that indigenous people and colonists alike organized society around kinship, and they understood that the bonds of kinship, especially those established through marriage and adoption, reinforced alliances between individuals and between polities. These kinship networks often developed along the region's waterways because most economic, military, and political activity in Middle America took place along those rivers. Second, over the course of about 600 years, from the fall of the Mississippian city of Cahokia, just east of present-day St. Louis, to the rise of the United States in the early 1800s, waves of native peoples, missionaries, traders, and imperialists attempted to remake the Mississippi Valley to suit their own interests. In each instance, though, the past influenced the new regime. The French Empire appended itself to the native political landscape of the midcontinent, and its efforts to control the region hinged on established relationships between Indian nations, as much as on interaction between those nations and the French. When Spain and Great Britain replaced France in the 1760s, they discovered that the actions and policies of their predecessors had forged a new political landscape that needed to be navigated as carefully as the rivers of the physical landscape. And then at the turn of the 19th century, Americans believed that the United States and its experiment in republicanism stood apart from its native and imperial predecessors. But as much as they pretended otherwise, Americans built their empire atop the remnants of French, British, and Spanish colonies on a continent still largely dominated by native peoples. This morning, I want to focus on one story that highlights both of these themes. That story is the decades-long conflict called the Illinois-Chickasaw War, or I should say that I call the Illinois-Chickasaw War. Other people just broadly refer to it as Chickasaw Wars or Franco-Chickasaw Wars, but I think that name, in a lot of ways, misunderstands its significance as really a conflict that originates among Native people and then consumes the French in the 1720s and 30s. The Illinois-Chickasaw War was a crucial event in the history of Middle America. It emerged out of the Indian slave trade at the end of the 17th century, and then it embroiled colonial powers. It threatened to sever French Louisiana, and it played a significant role in limiting French power and influence in the Mississippi Valley and the Illinois country on the eve of the 7 Years' War. Yet, the Illinois-Chickasaw War, as I said, remained rooted in the complex web of native-centered relationships that defined politics in this region. The intricacy of these relationships is revealed in a 1737 map presented by a Chickasaw chief named Mingo Oma in a diplomatic council with the French in 1737. Centered on the Chickasaw Nation, here letter L, this map noted the relative importance of each nation to the Chickasaws and revealed how they were connected. Like other native cartographers in the South, Mingo Oma used circles to signify these different nations, and the size of the circle represented the status of that nation, its importance, its size, etc. Large circles denoted particularly dangerous allies or particularly important friends. Smaller circles indicated moderately or minimally significant nations. And to orient us here, I want you to keep in mind that this is more or less the Ohio River, and then this is the Mississippi, and then the Gulf of Mexico is down here. So the geography of this is like north is at the bottom of the map and south is at the top. So let's all just turn upside down for a second and keep that in mind. And I want to highlight a few groups that Mingo Oma talks about or identifies on this map. K here is Choctaws, and then N represents Illinois and Miamis, and M is Hurons and Haudenosaunee, or Iroquois. The paths here are the upper and lower trade paths that connected Chickasaw Nation to South Carolina, going through the Cherokee Nation, which is letter E, as well as, and also F there, as well as multiple circles representing different divisions of the Muskogee Creeks. And from the circles indicated on the map, we can get a sense very clearly of who Mingo Oma realized or recognized as the biggest threats to the Chickasaws, as well as their closest allies. Choctaws, Illinois, Miamis, Haudenosaunee, and Hurons on one side, and Cherokees and Creeks, their friends, on the others. Tellingly, there's no way to tell the difference between native nations and Europeans on this map. Mingo Oma makes no distinction in the way that he drew them. If you didn't have the key to the map, you would have no idea who was who. He did not give them any special prominence, but we can see that A up there is the British in Carolina, and I here is the French, based in Mobile at this time. These are not large circles on the map. They are fairly middling players in this region. And Mingo Oma's map is an exceptional document. It's one of only about 3 or 4 native authored depictions of this political landscape. but it is representative of a broader conception of those relations. Any indigenous leader in the region would have possessed a similar understanding of these complex diplomatic networks. Each nation constructed extensive relations, built usually on a foundation of kinship. Chickasaws cultivated alliances with Muskogee Creeks and Cherokees, as well as with the English. Illinois Indians north of the Ohio River forged relations with Miamis, Osages, Quapaws, Ottawas, and many other nations, in addition to the French. And it's really important to understand that relations with colonial powers were only one aspect of this history. And in many cases, they were less significant than relations between different Indian nations. In contrast, European understandings of this region were very, very different. They believed that Native people were generally pawns in a larger game being played by European empires. They thought of Native people as auxiliaries who would do what they said and then go off and fight their wars, etc. And they were constantly concerned about who was allied with the French or who was allied with the British. But that story is so focused on Native ambitions and Native interests that it obscures a much broader history. True, France, as well as Britain, as well as Spain, did influence events in the midcontinent, but as Mingo Oma showed, Europeans were just one part of this story. So let's turn to this history. In the 17 teens, France launched new efforts to bring Middle America under its control. To strengthen their rule in the region, French imperialists focused on a few objectives. They wanted to secure the Mississippi River and its tributaries from the British. They wanted to safeguard travel between Louisiana and Canada, the two halves of its North American empire. And to achieve that goal, they focused especially on securing the Illinois country, the crossroads of French North America. And so you can see here on this map, the Wabash River connects up via a portage in the Maumee River to the Lake Erie. Illinois River connects up to Lake Michigan. All of those waterways allowed France and its colonists to travel back and forth between these two regions. But colonial officials struggled to connect their ambitions with their limited influence and power in the North American midcontinent. The empire lacked the strength to accomplish much on its own. The Illinois country was, under French organization, was part of the Louisiana colony, not part of Canada. And so you have to keep in mind that the Illinois country is really the northern part of Louisiana. It stretches all the way down to New Orleans and Mobile and the Gulf Coast. And across that vast area, France usually had about 700 soldiers. Not enough to exert any kind of authority here. Colonists in the Illinois country were more numerous, but their interests often differed significantly from the interests of the French Empire. They were interested in their personal endeavors, farming, trading, etc. The French Empire could not necessarily rely on them for support. As a result, France relied on native nations to back these ambitions. But the objectives of the French and of native nations were often very different. They were often competing. And they also used similar, but in crucial ways, diverging strategies to accomplish these goals. Throughout the first half of the 18th century, France struggled to build a lasting, stable alliance in Middle America. This is something that is often overlooked or mischaracterized in popular renderings of French North America. There's the stereotype that emerges largely after the 7 Years' War that the French were particularly adept at interacting with native people, that they had good relations, that they lived in peace, all of these things. But no French colonist in the 1700s would have understood that depiction. That would have been totally contradictory to their own experience. And in Middle America, the French discovered that their alliance was built on an ever-shifting ground. It was a structure that had a fractured foundation, always at risk of toppling. And the key to understanding the varying levels of success that the French had from the late 1600s to the 1700s in building this empire is to understand kinship. Since time immemorial, kinship had served as the basis of alliances in the midcontinent. And in the initial years of French colonization in the 1680s and 1690s, the French had recognized that, and they had tried to integrate into these indigenous networks. In the late 1600s, French colonists in the Illinois country happily embraced marriage as a tool of economic and political alliance building. One observer in the late 1600s referred that French colonists married Illinois women, quote unquote, every week, and said that they did this, quote, in the mode of the Indians of that country, meaning that they married according to indigenous customs, not in the Catholic Church. And these alliances in the 1680s and 1690s proved crucial in the ongoing war that France was fighting really throughout the late 1600s against the Six Nations of the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois. And that war continued until the Haudenosaunee, France, and most of the nations of the Great Lakes signed an uneasy peace in 1701. But it's important to recognize that hundreds, if not thousands, of Illinois people fought alongside French and other native nations against the Haudenosaunee in this time period. And it was largely a product of those kinship ties. But in the immediate aftermath of that victory and that peace treaty in 1701, France rejected French native intermarriage as a political tool. In 1709, officials in Canada advocated a ban on intermarriage. They warned, quote, one should never mix bad blood, meaning native people, with good, meaning French colonists. And in the middle of the next decade, the crown agreed. Louis XV feared that intermarriage would produce a colony of, quote, naturally lazy libertines. And colonial officials should, he said, prevent these sorts of marriages as much as possible. And the rates of intermarriage between Illinois people and French colonists rapidly declined. This had been very common in the 1680s and 1690s, but between 1720 and 1765, French priests in the Illinois country performed at least 272 weddings, and only 13 of those were of French Illinois couples. A few in the 1720s, one during the 1730s, and then 4 in the 1740s. And the product of this is that over time, these bonds of kinship between the French and the Illinois that had been so successful in the 1680s and 1690s weakened and dissipated. Now, I do want to say that kinship was not the only way of establishing alliances, and France had some other possibilities to demonstrate that it was a valuable, trustworthy ally, both in terms of economics and militarily. French soldiers often accompanied native men on military campaigns. They could demonstrate their prowess in battle and make themselves seem an attractive ally in that regard. French officials also offered gifts to native leaders. This was an act that served both as a way of demonstrating French wealth, again, sign of a positive ally, good ally, but also it demonstrated that they had respect for native people. So gift giving served both a practical purpose of, you need the certain thing, I'm going to give it to you, but also it's a sign of generosity and of respect. But imperial constraints limited the effectiveness of each of these options. French soldiers could only fight against mutual enemies, and only when they were allowed to do so by French imperial policy. As a result, there are many instances where native peoples come to the French fort in the Illinois country and say, we're going to launch this attack, will you come with us? And they say, no, we can't. So there's an unreliability there. And at the same time, even as officials in the colonies recognized the need to demonstrate generosity, officials in France, in Versailles, were saying, hey, you really need to cut costs. We're going to send fewer things. Why are you spending so much money? And so both economic and military benefits of allying with France were limited. Now, there were some ways to compensate for this. And the most successful relationships between the French Empire and Native peoples, especially Illinois and the Illinois country and Miami's along the Wabash River Valley, depended upon personal relationships between Native people and French officials in that area. Now, these were not intermarriages. They were more like friendships. But local French officials, if they stayed in a place for years or for decades and demonstrated that they respected and could aid Native people, they became trusted allies. This is particularly true of the St. Ange family that operated in the Illinois country with Illinois people, and with the Vincennes family that operated in the Wabash River Valley. Some of you have probably heard of Vincennes, Indiana. That is named after this family. In recognition, it was named in the 1700s in recognition of their service for the French Empire among the Miami Nation. Unfortunately for the empire, though, these are exceptional, the Vincennes and St. Ange families. And in most places, they're very short-lived commandants at these posts. They come in, they don't understand what's going on, they're desperate to get out, they get a promotion, or some cases they get killed or get sick and die, and then someone else comes in and there's a rotating cast of people. And that makes it very difficult to build these relationships that are so dependent upon trust. So in the 17 teens, France launches this campaign of establishing more direct imperial control over the Illinois country. And it's not using intermarriage. It's hoping to demonstrate its value as a political, military, economic ally, and also to use personal relationships between officials and Native people as a foundation for this. And again, their goal is to secure this middle part of the valley, to allow easy travel both between the Gulf Coast and the Illinois country, and more broadly between Louisiana and Canada. But there is a problem here. And that is that a successful alliance that secures peaceful access to the Mississippi Valley requires that the French ally with both the Illinois in the Illinois country and also the Chickasaws here in what is now Western Tennessee and northern Mississippi. And that is impossible. Illinois and Chickasaws are two of the most powerful and two of the most important nations in the region. And together they occupy a key part of this river system. But they do not like each other. They have animosity stretching back into the late 1600s, and France cannot be friends with both of them. Now, France has stronger relations with the Illinois nation, and they identify them as being their most important ally in the midcontinent. But they believe in the first 2 decades of the 1700s, first 2.5 decades of the 1700s, that they can also ally with the Chickasaws, and that they can bring all of these nations together in one alliance that is led by the French and that allows them to execute this imperial plan. But between 1700 and 1750s, political and geographical realities thwarted these French attempts to construct a mighty alliance through the waterways of the midcontinent. The French were not powerless, but they had numerous limitations, some imposed by themselves, many imposed by Native peoples, and others simply imposed by the geographical realities of the region. Versailles was unwilling or unable to expend necessary resources to maintain alliances. Military aid was inconsistent, and so much of these relations depended upon local agents, some of whom were excellent, some of whom were, to be generous, not. And so France relied upon Native allies. And as a result, they found themselves drawn into local conflicts that ballooned into expensive imperial wars. These wars curtailed French ambitions and eventually exposed French vulnerabilities and reduced the empire's influence even among its closest allies. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, so I want to go back to the beginning. The Illinois-Chickasaw War likely emerged in the context of the Indian slave trade. At the end of the 17th century, the Mississippi Valley was the nexus of two different slave trades. One was directed from the Illinois country, and Illinois people captured slaves from nations on the Great Plains and in the South, and then either sold them or gave them as gifts to French colonists and officials, and occasionally traded with the English who were operating at that point on the Tennessee River. At the same time, Chickasaws were operating as part of a slave trade that went east and west across the South. Chickasaws attacked throughout the Mississippi Valley, capturing native people who they then sold to colonists in English Carolina. It's a little hard to know exactly how the conflict between Illinois and Chickasaws emerged, but we know roughly when it emerged. We know what these nations were doing independently, and it's not hard to make a guess that they were competitors in this trade. Maybe raiders from the different nations encountered one another while they were each out launching these slave raids. Regardless, by the end of the 1600s, the two nations were at war. In 1698, Chickasaw struck a devastating blow against the Illinois town of Cahokia, distinct from the Mississippian chiefdom that existed centuries earlier, but sharing a name. This was one of the Illinois' principal towns, and the Chickasaws killed at least 10 men and captured about 100 women and children. Illinois warriors retaliated, and by the early 1700s, this region is engulfed in warfare. And so by the early 1700s, this war between Chickasaws and Illinois endangered French efforts to strengthen their hold on the mid-continent. River travelers between Louisiana and the Illinois country were at constant risk of being attacked because their journey required them to travel through a war zone. Now again, this war emerged independently of French interests, French ambitions, etc. But Europeans soon became both participants and often victims in this fighting. Chickasaw warriors targeted French traders traveling up and down the Mississippi, recognizing that they were carrying weapons, ammunition, etc., to the Illinois country, which would then be used against them. And even more troubling for the French was that this war expanded beyond the Illinois and Chickasaws. In 1716, Louisiana Governor Jean-Baptiste Le Moyne de Bienville reported that the central Mississippi Valley swarmed with, quote, warriors of the Illinois, Miami, Chickasaw, and Cherokee nations who made war on each other and who ordinarily killed and plundered all those whom they found on the way. By the 1720s, Chickasaws dominated a large section of the Mississippi River, and their power threatened to sever the two ends of Louisiana, the Gulf Coast and the Illinois country. Chickasaw country was the true border between these two parts of Louisiana. And when Chickasaws restricted commerce and travel, they endangered the lives and livelihood of French colonists hundreds of miles apart. One other aspect of French colonial history in the Illinois country is how much of it was agricultural, not rooted in the fur trade. And so for much of these first decades of the 1700s, the colonies in lower Louisiana depended on wheat that was grown in the Illinois country for sustenance. And there are some years where Illinois farmers exported 100,000 pounds of flour down the Mississippi River to lower Louisiana. And in return, the boats brought back guns, ammunition, various kinds of food, diplomatic presence, etc. And so these two halves of French Louisiana are dependent upon one another, but Chickasaws make it difficult to maintain those connections. And this is the context for France's project starting in the mid-17 teens of building a stronger empire in the mid-continent. So between the 17 teens and the 1730s, France constructed a series of posts throughout the Mississippi River Valley and its tributaries. And I'm just going to do a little bit of geography here to demonstrate their ambitions, because I think the location of these forts is really significant. So we have Fort Miami here on the Maumee River, and particularly at the portage between the Maumee River and the Wabash. That is one of the places required to portage if you're traveling from the Great Lakes to the Mississippi River. Then we have Fort Weotnon a little farther down the river among Weas, which is one of the divisions of the Miamis. And then farther down, Fort Vincennes, which is established a little bit later among Piankeshaws, another group of Miamis. We have Fort Deschartres here on the Mississippi River, close to Kaskaskia and other Illinois Indian communities. And then farther south, there's Arkansas Post, which is established earlier, abandoned, and then reestablished during this time period. And farther downstream, of course, there's New Orleans, Natchez, and a few other communities. So on one hand, this appears to be a very impressive display of power, right? In 15 years, the French construct half a dozen forts throughout these waterways. But in reality, French authority did not extend very far beyond these individual outposts. As I mentioned, France has very few troops in this region. Most of these forts are garrisoned by 25, sometimes as many as 50, but still not many soldiers. And also, France never established a permanent post on the Mississippi River in this crucial area between Fort Deschartres and Arkansas Post. Several hundred miles of some of the most strategically important land on the continent that was also the center of conflict between Illinois and Chickasaws. In 1729, the fragility of French imperialism in the midcontinent burst into full view. That year, Natchez Indians, a little farther down the Mississippi River, destroyed an encroaching French settlement, which is now Natchez, Mississippi. And for the next 2 years, the French and their Choctaw allies retaliated against the Natchez, waging a devastating war that sent Natchez refugees fleeing across the South. Many Natchez found shelter among the Chickasaws, which the French interpreted as an act of war on the part of that host nation. So in the late 1720s and early 1730s, France wants to destroy the Natchez people, wage a campaign of genocide against them. And Chickasaws are taking in Natchez refugees, really in a practice that is well established across the Mississippi Valley of providing care and refuge for people in this kind of situation. And so this breaks French policy, which up to that point had really been trying to encourage an alliance between France and the Chickasaws, but now it turns very clearly to war. But France does not launch a direct attack on Chickasaws. Instead, it encourages a proxy war. It encourages Illinois, Quapaws, Miamis, and others to attack into Chickasaw Nation, to attack remnant Natchez communities. And they acknowledge as much, that they don't have the power to carry out these campaigns on their own. Robert Groston de Saint-Onge, member of this prominent colonial family in the Illinois country, writes in 1732, "The Chickasaws and the Natchez will only be destroyed by the Illinois Indians who make themselves much feared." He wants to provide Illinois Indians with the ability to wage this war, and he argues that the French need to take steps to control Illinois Indians who will then fight on their behalf. That is a misguided approach in a lot of ways, but it is their mentality. But this is not a war that the French Empire could wage on its own, much less win. But by 1735, both Louisiana Governor Jean-Pierre Lemoyne de Bienville, Jean-Baptiste, I think, Lemoyne de Bienville, and some Chickasaw leaders were tired of this conflict. They wanted to find a way to make peace. Weighing the potential cost of an extended campaign in Chickasaw country and the lack of French casualties thus far, Bienville believed that his superiors would support a negotiated end to the peace. At the same time, a Chickasaw leader named Imatubby began to make overtures to the French, hoping to end this conflict. Now, I want to do a little bit of geography of Chickasaw Nation at this time period. This is a 1730s map. As you can tell from the style, it's likely a copy of an indigenous drawn map, but it is in the French archives under the name of a French person. But my guess is that it is a native drawn map, although we don't know by who. But this is of the different villages of the Chickasaw Nation. And more helpfully, this one is more or less oriented north to south. You can see the sign there. And so this is the northern part, this is the southern part, and these three villages here at the southeastern edge of Chickasaw Nation are more interested in seeking peace with the French, particularly because they're more susceptible to raids from Choctaws. They are suffering the brunt of these attacks, and Imatubby is the chief at Town M there called Cahokia. And so Imatubby reaches out. He wants to make peace with the French. Bienville is also very interested in stopping this conflict. But Imatubby only represents one faction of Chickasaws. And in the ensuing months following these initial overtures, actions by other Chickasaws, the Illinois, and the French scuttled these plans at peace. And I want to tell a story that in many ways is fairly minor, not significant on its face, but it set in action a series of events that ended up proving disastrous for the French Empire in the middle of the Mississippi River Valley. And so in the spring of 1735, a French officer named Ducodère led 10 soldiers south from Fort Deschartres, up there in the Illinois country, down the river to Arkansas Post. Again, this several hundred miles of river that the French don't really have a presence on. They go there to retrieve 1,700 pounds of gunpowder that had been left there the previous spring by three French officers, or the previous fall by three French officers. Now, I want to explain the significance of this, right? So they leave this gunpowder, belongs to the French Empire. Now, remember, there's a war happening, right? That is, that is the context. And the French in particular are using gunpowder, ammunition, and other things to support Illinois, Miami's, and other native nations in their attacks on the Chickasaws. So they need this gunpowder, but these French officers had left it there. Second, this stretch of river is dangerous. And as a result of this decision, Ducodère and his party have to make an unnecessary trip along this path between Fort Deschartres and Arkansas Post. But finally, the reason that those officers left the gunpowder behind was because they wanted to create space on the French boats for their merchandise, which they were going to use to set up a side business in the fur trade. And so they are putting forward their own interest, their own business interest, at the expense of the French imperial project. So you have unreliable French officers. You have then this unnecessary trip down the Mississippi River to fetch these needed supplies. And at that exact moment, a party of Illinois Indians, again, engaging in their own conflict with the Chickasaws, but at this point encouraged by the French, are raiding one of these northern Chickasaw towns here. Maybe Chucalissa here in A, but somewhere in this northwestern part of the Chickasaw Nation. They abduct some Chickasaw captives, they kill a couple people, and then they return north. Mingo Oma, the author of the map I showed at the beginning, and a Chickasaw chief from that part of the nation, leads a party of a couple hundred Chickasaws and Natchez on the path of the Illinois. They crossed to the Mississippi River, which is how the Illinois usually returned back upstream. And there they find Ducodère and his soldiers on the bank of the river, taking a break from their arduous journey back upstream. Chickasaw say, "Don't shoot." The French soldiers either don't understand or they're too frightened to listen, and they open fire on the Chickasaws. Again, there are about a dozen French soldiers. There are more than 200 Natchez and Chickasaws, and all but 3 of the French soldiers are killed, and the 3 soldiers are taken captive. Now, each incident in this chain of events is fairly common. French travelers being attacked on the river, Illinois Indians raiding Chickasaws, Chickasaws pursuing them. But together they push Bienville to a course of action that ends up severely damaging the status of the French Empire in the midcontinent. Up to this point, Bienville had largely used the absence of French casualties as a reason to seek peace. He could say, we have not really suffered anything from this conflict. We don't like that the Chickasaws are hosting the Natchez, but we've not suffered any casualties. This is okay. But Ducodère's casualties in the spring of 1735 changed that. And Bienville says that he thought afterward that a campaign against the Chickasaws was, quote, the only way that he had to get out of this affair honorably. And so Bienville spends the next year planning an attack. And his goal is to launch a 2-pronged attack, one from the Illinois country, one from the French outpost at Mobile, Alabama. And none of this goes well. The French have trouble getting the number of troops that they think they need. The preparations are really slow. They have to coordinate this attack. They intend to attack both sides of the Chickasaw Nation at the same time, with the party coming from the Illinois country, led by an officer named Pierre d'Artaguiette, attacking the northwestern corner of Chickasaw Nation there, while Bienville and an army of French soldiers and Choctaw warriors will attack the southeastern part of the nation. And I want to focus particularly on the party coming from the Illinois country. Bienville asks for 300 soldiers and militia. Pierre d'Artaguiette is able to recruit about half that number. So again, they're dependent upon native allies. About 300 Illinois, Miamis, Quapaws, and Haudenosaunee join the party, so that's about 2/3 of the total force. And they make their way south. By the time d'Artaguiette is ready to attack in March of 1736, Bienville is running 2 months behind schedule. He had planned to be there in the early spring. He finally arrives in Chickasaw country in May of 1736. This is an important detail that d'Artaguiette does not know. And so on March 25th, 1736, d'Artaguiette, with his army of about 400 French and indigenous fighters, attacks that town A there called Chocalisa, often referred to, including here in this map, by its Choctaw name, Ogulachitoka. This is a disaster. The battle begins, and according to this French depiction from a little bit later in the year, you can see, we have this great plan, we're going to get them in a crossfire, all this is going to go well. But again, they encounter the enemy and everything falls apart. So about 15 minutes into the battle, 400 or 500 Chickasaw warriors flank d'Artaguiette's army, and the Illinois, Miami, and other native people who are with d'Artaguiette's force, they say, well, this looks bad, we should leave. And that is because of particular native understandings about warfare. They're interested in surprise, they want to minimize casualties. Standing and fighting after you have been outflanked is not part of the way that they conduct warfare. The French, on the other hand, are like, well, we need to stand and fight. We came all this way. What are we doing? And they stand and they get absolutely devastated. It's a devastating defeat for the French. They lose maybe as many as half of the 140 or so soldiers who were involved in the battle. And Darche-Guet is captured along with Francois-Marie Bissot de Vincennes from the Wabash River, and about 20 other officer soldiers, as well as a Jesuit priest. Chickasaws execute all but 2 of these prisoners in retaliation for their attack on the Chickasaw town. So a few weeks later, Bienville finally gets to Chickasaw country. He launches his own attack. He doesn't know that Darche-Guet has met this disaster. He knows that he's way behind, but he doesn't know exactly what's happening. So another defeat at Cahokia. And the results of these defeats are disastrous for the French. Bienville had launched this campaign to chastise Chickasaws, to enact retribution for this attack on the French convoy in the spring of 1735. But instead, Chickasaws win 2 very important victories and then expand their presence in the midcontinent. By the summer of 1736, French officers in the midcontinent are reporting that Chickasaws have established a fort on the Ohio River near present-day Louisville, Kentucky, and are using that as a base to launch attacks farther north. And at the same time that this is happening, this expansion of Chickasaw presence, Chickasaw leaders are also meeting with French and other native diplomats and talking about these victories and using them as weapons in their negotiations. Chickasaw Chief Mingo Oma in 1737 meets with a French official, actually the brother of Pierre Darche-Guet, who died at Chocalisa in March 1736. And he knows that the French are likely planning another campaign, and he says, what do the French think they are doing? And of what use are our scalps to pay them for it, that they try to persuade all the nations to dip their hands in our blood? But he makes a very important point here, or very important accusation. He says, and are they not, the French, are they not satisfied with the 2 attacks that they have made and in which they have not succeeded because of the great confidence that they have had in the Indians who accompany them? So what Mingo Oma is doing here is he's saying, you all have lost badly and it's your allies' fault. Now, the French are desperate to believe this. They also really want to think, well, this isn't our fault. Of course, there's no way we could be responsible for these defeats. It's their fault. It's the Illinois fault. It's Miami's fault. And Bienville happily embraces this. And as he's planning a second campaign in 1737 and 1738, he believes that he could, quote, avoid the misfortunes of 1736 if he excludes Illinois and Miami's from the campaign. This does not work. After about 3 years of planning in the winter of 1739-1740, Bienville does launch a second campaign that doesn't go anywhere. They land near present-day Memphis. They spend months digging a road that they plan to transport artillery into Chickasaw Nation. And finally, everyone gets frustrated. Some Chickasaws say, hey, you want to make peace? And Bienville says, yeah, this peace doesn't accomplish anything except it gives Bienville something very minor that it can say, hey, this was not a total waste of men, resources, money, etc. But the main effect that it has is that it infuriates Illinois and Miami's, who say, why are you making peace with our enemies? And so by the beginning of the 1740s, these relations are severely strained. Now, France's entrance into the Illinois-Chickasaw War came at a precarious time in the history of the Illinois-French alliance. Looking back to the late 1600s and early 1700s, they had this strong foundation of intermarriage that allowed them to achieve victory over the Six Nations of the Haudenosaunee. But then in the 1700s, France abandoned that strategy at the exact moment that it was trying to strengthen its presence in the midcontinent. And again, they relied on these close relations between local French officers and native people as a way to bolster those alliances in the absence of actual familial kinship ties. And these relationships were already fraying by the 1730s. And the defeat at Chocalisa brought those fraying relations into clear focus. So among the soldiers who were killed, including those who were captured and then executed after the battle, were a an important handful of these local agents who had worked for the French Empire for years and decades in Native communities. Vincennes was one of them, probably the most prominent of these. He, like a half a dozen other men who died that day, had spent years in the Illinois or Miami Nation, often from childhood. They knew these, they knew Native leaders, they knew these Native communities, and with dozens and dozens of casualties in March of 1736, France had to face the reality of replacing many different officials all at the same time without a clear set of competent replacements. And so by the early 1740s, the French alliance in the central Mississippi Valley was in tatters. Far from ending the Chickasaw threat, Bienville's failed campaigns had devastated the French and alienated many of their native allies. Distrust destroyed the once close alliance between the French and the Illinois and Miamis. French influence in the mid-continent never recovered from the dual disasters of the Chickasaw campaigns in 1736 and 1740. Bienville's replacement commented in 1750, "We can do nothing by ourselves, and we are obliged to resort to our allies for the least insult, a situation to which we were reduced by the campaigns of 1736 and 1740s against the Chickasaws. These defeats," he said, "have inspired the nations with such a great contempt for our lack of knowledge of how to reduce the Indians that all take advantage of it, as I perceive every day, which causes me pain and difficulties that will not end." This is a great job, right? This is really a nice day at work to try to repair these relationships that had been damaged so badly. But the story of the Chickasaw Wars underscores the ways that long-standing relations between Native peoples in the mid-continent established the parameters of the possible. France wanted to construct this far-reaching alliance that allowed them to travel safely and securely through the mid-continent, but they could not do that because of the ongoing rivalries between these nations. Chickasaws, Illinois, and the French could not be in a single alliance. And by the 1740s, they had learned that pre-existing Native coalitions were not so easily displaced that they could simply move in and establish their own ambitions. And by this time, despite decades of French colonialism, the political landscape of the mid-continent bore more resemblance to Chickasaw Chief Mingo Oma's map than it did to European conceptions of the regions. French imperialists thought of Middle America as a place that they could impose their will, at least they did in the 1710s. But in reality, peoples like the Illinois, the Chickasaws, and Miamis pursued their own policies and employed diplomacy and warfare to achieve their own ambitions independent of European wishes. In the mid-continent, European colonies remained smaller circles surrounded by larger, more influential native nations. But France's failure also stemmed from a critical strategic mistake: its refusal to reinforce its alliance with bonds of kinship. Many of the native alliances that waged war against Chickasaws in the 1730s survived, but their alliance with the French did not. Following their failures in 1736 and 1740, France's relations with native nations in the Illinois country and the Wabash Valley became increasingly strained, and French officials lacked the resources, the people necessary to repair them. In that way, these conflicts in the 1730s highlight the broader history of Middle America in the 18th century, and really over many centuries. Ambitious individuals, families, and nations relied on the power of kinship to achieve wealth and power. And those who either could not or would not follow suit increasingly found themselves in a precarious and untenable position. Thank you.
Let me just ask you one question that came in. Can you tell us a little bit about the kind of sources that you've been using?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
So I really draw on an array of sources. As Aaron mentioned, my first chapter is based heavily on archaeological records, and I try to continue to use those throughout the project. But then I use a variety of French and Spanish and British colonial sources, records of the Catholic parish in the Illinois country, showing these records of marriages and other interactions between the French Catholic Church and Native people. And also, I use a lot of descriptions of Native people and Native cultural practices, often from people who spent a long time in those areas. Now, you can't use those uncritically. They often make assumptions about the reasons Native people did certain things or believe certain things, but you can get a lot of important information about what Native people did. And so, for example, understanding Native warfare, there's a great source from the late 1600s or very early 1700s by a longtime French trader in the Illinois country who writes about his experiences fighting alongside Illinois people, and says, this is how they fight. They try to minimize casualties. If you have too many casualties, they will no longer fight alongside with you. And so really bringing all of those different things together allows me to tell this much broader story, and understand a history that otherwise is difficult to access from any single source base.
Great, thank you so much. Let's express our appreciation. Thank you.